السلام على مشاهدينا في العالم العربي أينما كنتم، أهلا وسهلا بكم في الجزء الثاني في حوارنا مع الكاتب الأمريكي فيليب يانسي. مرة أخرى في ممنوع انتقلنا إلى هذا البلد، إلى ولاية كولورادو من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، موصلة لحوارنا في الجزء الثاني لهذا الكاتب الذي أثارت كتبه العديد من ردود الفعل، خاصة في الدوائر الإنجيلية الأمريكية وغيرها من العالم. هذا الكاتب الذي تجرأ أن يطرح الأسئلة بمقدار قد يهز معتقدات الكثيرين. هذا الكاتب الذي يعتبر نفسه صديقا حميما للكلمة كما وردت في الكتاب المقدس، يحل علينا ضيفا في هذا الجزء الثاني من ممنوع هذا المساء. Philip, in the first part of this interview, we went jumping from different topics, yes. And it's the journey of life. Actually, we don't know when we start our lives, when life gonna take us. Right. What was your expectation for this interview?
I usually get a theme in advance. I publish a book, say on the problem of pain or on prayer or whatever. So when I'm about to be interviewed, I go through what I've written about it and I think, oh, this story might work, this story might work. How can I fit them in? But in this case, I didn't know what we were going to talk about. So I just said, we'll roll with it as it happens. I didn't really have expectations.
Thank you. In Mumnua, which is forbidden in Arabic, we have the chance many times to address difficult issues, which is open the door to have you with us. You ask difficult questions to God. Those questions are the books today.
Yes.
Can you tell me why and how do you ask those questions, and how do you deal with the reaction, especially with the religious people and those who doesn't like your questions?
How do I deal with the religious people? I'll start there. I'm a freelance writer.
Yes.
They don't know where I live. I don't have to raise money. I don't have any donors. I don't have a board of directors. And that is my identity. It's kind of the lone pilgrim, free to ask whatever is troubling me, whatever is bothering me. And frankly, when my hair turned gray, people started treating me a little nicer. You know, I used to get a lot of hate mail.
At least you have some. Some people, they lost
That's
it all.
right, that's right. I used to get a lot of negative mail. But over time, people who didn't want to read me stopped reading me, and I kept talking to people who had some of the same issues, some of the same questions and doubts that I have. So it's gotten milder over time.
What was the book or the article you wrote and made a huge, difficult reaction? And you felt like people, they wrote you back or talked to you back and they felt you're attacking them or they're angry against Philip Yancey.
Right. Well, I wrote a book called What's So Amazing About Grace. I don't know what the Arab title is. You can fill that in. But there are two chapters in there that got me a lot of mail. My poor mailman, I think he had to have shoulder surgery from carrying
those days.
The bags, yes. There was one chapter on Bill Clinton, who was the president when I was writing the book.
And you said he wrote you a letter.
That's right. Yep. And I interviewed him, and mainly we talked about how much hate mail he was getting from Christians, how ungraciously Christians were treating him. So there was an article, there was a chapter on Bill Clinton, and then there was a chapter on a friend of mine who had been a friend for probably 10 years and was involved in ministry, and then it turned out that he was homosexual. And what I learned from that, the reason I included both of those chapters, is that it doesn't take any grace to be around someone who thinks like you, looks like you, smells like you, acts like you. That doesn't take grace. Where grace is put to the test is when we're with someone that we disapprove of or that we have trouble with or that irritates us. And I guess the reactions of the people who objected to what I wrote kind of proves that point, that we still need a lot to learn about grace. And
is this the theme of your life? Is this your mission? It's like, if I ask you, what's the one concept, the one word you consider your mission, Philip? Grace?
Can you give me 2 words?
I'll give you 3.
Grace is one, and then the problem of suffering is the other. Grace and suffering. Those are the 2 themes. No matter what I start writing about, I end up writing about them. So I write a book about prayer, and I end up writing about suffering because so much of our prayer doesn't get answered the way we want.
Some people, they may criticize you. They say, oh, Philip, he repeats himself here and there, but with different stories. How do you answer this?
If you walk into a religious bookstore, a lot of it seems like propaganda, frankly. I'll speak about Christian bookstores. You know, how to be happy, how God solves all of your problems, how God will save
3
your
steps
marriage. Yeah, 4 steps
5.
to save. And then every year, people still get divorced, people still die, people still have unanswered prayers. And so somebody's got to write for those people. And so I just accepted as my mission to write, not maybe for everybody, but for those people who have to struggle and they feel like they're alone. And when you're alone, a book is a companion, because you can read a book and say, oh, I'm not the only one. I often get that line
and
from
you
readers
can be
who write
who
me.
you are. The book, you're just yourself and a book.
Not only that, you are in control of the book. So if somebody comes up to my door and says, I want to tell you something, you know, immediately my defenses go up. But in a book, that's non-threatening because the reader is in control. If they don't like what I'm writing, they close the book. So it's a gentle way of communicating. And when you're dealing with those themes, suffering and trying to get people to be more gracious, I think that kind of gentle approach works better than the preachment. This is how you should change. That doesn't work so well.
Philip, it attracted me that you focus a lot in your speeches and your teaching, in your writing, that God's heroes are the failed, the unsuccessful people, the simple ones. Yet, you're a successful person.
You wanted me to talk about my failures, don't you? I would say I'm a blessed person. There are a lot of stories from the earlier part of my life that I have not yet told. And I will just assure you, I have known failure, I have known pain and suffering.
And Mumnu and forbidden, can we have one unique story you never told before?
One that I've never told before. They're intimate family stories, so I feel a little uncomfortable just on the spot. But I'll tell you one that I just recently told, and that's the story of my father. My father died of polio. I was just 1 year old, so I have no memory of my father. He was planning to be a missionary, and a remarkable man, remarkable Christian. He got polio, was totally paralyzed, was in an iron lung that breathed for him. And a group of Christians became convinced that he would be healed. And so they prayed and prayed, and finally had so much faith, they removed him from the iron lung, and then he died. And my whole life has been lived under the shadow of that error that Christians made. And these are people who loved him, who obviously wanted him to be alive, but they were convinced this is God's will, and they were wrong. And so early on I realized what we believe about some of these important issues, like suffering, prosperity, success, these kind of things.
That's my other question.
Okay, what we believe is important.
Now, today, it's a big wave of prosperity gospel. How do you see that? If you believe in Jesus, he will bless you, you have cars, houses, money, bank account. When Jesus promised 2 things, at least of my knowledge, eternal life and persecution. And I never find another clear promises, yet this is what is taking place from America to the world. Prosperity gospel.
You're absolutely right. Jesus said, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. You know, he didn't say like conquerors among peasants or something. And as I understand it, of course, Judas, one of the original 12, died. And then of the 11 who were left, 10 of them died martyrs' deaths. So they certainly didn't experience prosperity. Or the Apostle Paul ended up in prison. He had, if you read his biography, it was just full of the opposite of prosperity. So
the early church was...
The early church was persecuted by the Roman Empire. At the same time, I believe it's true that if we live in the way God wants us to live, and that means being honest, caring about justice, caring about the poor, reaching out to the sick, when you do that, and when that spreads, as it did among the early Christians, everything rises. So for example, in Brazil, where you hear a lot of prosperity gospel, sociologists have studied, and here's what happens. An evangelist comes to a town, and he says, if you change, then everything will be good in your life.
Right.
Okay. Well, there's a man there who's kind of an alcoholic, and his wife drags him to this meeting, but he says, oh, okay, I'll give that a chance. So he goes forward, he prays, and lo and behold, he becomes a Christian. So he stops getting drunk every weekend, and then he starts going to work on time on Monday instead of sleeping in from his hangover. And the foreman notices this and says, I think I'll give you a raise. So he gives him more money. And then with that money, they have money to pay for their children's education. And it's true that over time, as that spreads, as they've studied these little towns in Brazil, there is prosperity. The whole thing rises. But it's not like God drops a bundle of money into their laps. And Christians still have problems. Christians still get sick. Christians still die. 100% of Christians die. Christians still lose their job.
Like this 100%.
Yeah, right. They still lose their jobs. So we go through hard times. It's also true that if we live the way God wants us to live, it's good for us.
Blessings.
Yeah, there are blessings. And some of them are natural. If you start treating people in a certain way, they start treating you back in a different way. And as I said, we're supposed to be pioneer settlers of the way God wants us to be human, a different way of being human than the rest of the world.
Between two ideas I'm thinking of now, and I would love really to use my time with you. One of the pain, how to deal with real problems of pain, especially with what happened this summer, the war in Gaza, what happened to the Christians of Iraq and Mosul get kicked out from their cities, their churches, and that's for my region. And Libya, it's taking fire, people getting killed every day by hundreds in the Middle East and North Africa. What so-called Arab Spring taking place turned to a nightmare in many ways. Where is Jesus in the middle of all this? And where's the Christian and where's the church? What role can you see?
I would say first that God is always on the side of the one suffering. It's easy to think when something bad happens, God is against me, God is punishing me. But if we take our clues as Christians from Jesus, and if you wonder how God feels about people who are going through difficult times, just follow Jesus around and see how he responds to a widow who lost her only son. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus came from God. And so what happened when he came? Well, we know the story of the massacre of the babies in Bethlehem. We know the story of being a refugee in Egypt. You know, Jesus, God, we believe God does know what it's like, and God is always on the side of the sufferer. And where is the church? Once somebody said, I was being interviewed on a radio program, and this person said, okay, you wrote a book called Where is God When It Hurts? Can you just answer that question in one sentence?
Jonas, we have the sentence in one word.
Yeah, that's right. And I said, oh, wow. I guess I would answer it with another question. Where is the church when it hurts? Because if we are God's representatives on earth. And if we are on the front lines, and I know, because I support them, there are Christian groups in the midst of Gaza and the West Bank and and the Sudan and Nigeria, who are reaching out to refugees and bringing food, and also with refugees in Lebanon and Jordan from the Syrian wars. There are Christian groups who are getting prayers from Christians around the world, getting donations of supplies and money. And if the church is there on the front lines, even among the least likely places, for example, the Pakistan earthquake, they were surprised that so many Christian groups were the first ones on the ground, not to convert them, but to express this is what we believe God feels. God cares about what you're going through. And as God's representative, we want to express that care.
But also Christians, they made mistakes.
Oh, yes.
Like what happened in Haiti and through history, and that's damaged the work of Christians today. Lots of people, like we talked in the first episode about, like any mission, it's conceived by, the crusade, the colonialism, the bad Christian baggage. After this break, we'll come back to this question.
Okay.
نخرج في هذا الفاصل ثم نعود. لفيليب يانسي مؤلفات كثيرة باللغة الإنجليزية، ترجم البعض منها إلى اللغة العربية. لعل واحد من أهم كتبه ما أعجب النعمة. هذا الكتاب الأكثر شهرة، فقد بيعت منه 14 مليون نسخة في جميع أنحاء العالم، وجعله واحد من أشهر الكتاب المسيحيين. هذا الكتاب وغيره من الكتب التي كتبها فيليب يانسي، ككتابه عندما لا تمطر السماء، الذي يطرح فيه 3 أسئلة يتساءلها المؤمنون خلسة، ونادرا ما يتفوهون بها جهرا. هل الله ظالم؟ هل يصمت الله أمام كل ما يحدث؟ هل يختبئ الله أمام كل هذا الظلم؟ أسئلة تطرح بأشكال تتحداك، تتحدى إيمانك. هكذا هو فيليب يانسي في كتبه الأخرى بالكاد نجوت، عندما لا تمطر السماء، محاولة لقاء مع إله غير منظور، وكتابه الصلاة. أسئلة تطرح وتطرح بقوة في داخل كل إنسان، وأن اختلفت الأديان. Some of my friends, when they heard I'm going to interview Mr. Filipe Yancey, I get emails and they send me questions. Some of them, you need to ask him this or that. I mean, like, literally, I want to be faithful to those friends who they like you, they love your books and writings. And I'm going to now move to some people's questions.
Great.
One of the questions came from different friends. It's about clash of civilizations. What do you think about, are we really in a war between West and East because of our faith or different civilizations? How do you see this problem?
I like to go back to a principle that was first spoken by Dag Hammarskjöld. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations back in the 1950s and 60s. And he, as representative of the United Nations, was put in the middle of true clashes, between, in those days, communist versus capitalist and different religions. And he said, my approach is always to try to find the smallest point of common ground and then work out from there. And I believe that is he was a deep Christian. I believe that is the Christian approach. So that when I'm with Muslims, I'm not a Muslim, Buddhist, I'm not a Buddhist, Jews, I'm not a Jew, I want to start not by how we're different, I want to start by what we share in common. And actually, as a Christian, I have a lot in common with Muslims and also with Jews. We believe in one God. We believe a lot of the characteristics of God are the same. We have great respect for Jesus. Christians see Jesus a little differently, but let's start there and work out. And I think the West, particularly my country, because we act like the policemen of the world, we've made some tremendous errors in kind of imposing our will on the rest of the world. And we should just be very blunt about that And I think the United States is beginning to realize that you can't go into a place like Iraq or Afghanistan and impose a solution. Mm-hmm. We thought we could. The leaders thought they could. Well, it's clear they could not. You can't do things like that by force.
The situation in the Middle East, it's a real mess. When you see the news, how do you analyze it and see it and understand what's happening in Syria and Iraq and all those places in Afghanistan, as an American now, not as Philip Yancey, the writer?
I tend to be on the side of the underdog. So I tend to think not of the people actually shooting the guns, but the civilians who bear the carnage. They call it collateral damage. It's not collateral at all. If you lose your child, if you lose your father, that's not collateral. And these people who sit in their offices and make these decisions about invasions and all that, you know, I wish they could know the people who bear the brunt of those decisions. I was invited one time in with there were 10 Jews, 10 Christians, and 10 Muslims. We were invited for a weekend together in New Orleans by a psychiatrist, a man named Scott Peck. And he had this theory that we think we can create community by coming to agreement. So let's get these people together, solve their issues, and then gradually they can become friends. And his theory was, it's the other way around. Let's get to know each other as human beings and become friends first, and then we can solve the issues. And I'm sure you've heard of these outreach camps where they have Christians and Muslims together, and you know, a 15-year-old, they come in with certain prejudices, but as they're out playing games, as they're sitting around the fire singing songs, you know, suddenly they realize we're all human beings. Let's start with that common ground. And we Christians especially believe that our obligation is to love the stranger, to love the other, one who is different than we are, not just people who are like we are.
Philip, one communist friend of mine sent me an email. He said, clearly said, like, you Christians, you defend only Christian cases and you don't care about what's happening to Muslims in Burma and getting killed in many other places. You don't care about lots of non-Christian. Like, what do you think about the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, for example, and the Muslims who are facing bad persecutions in different countries, and the Christians?
Well, I think your friend has hit a point that I would agree with. We Christians have not done a very good job of expressing that we care as much about the people who are in Palestine and the people who are the ones who receive the Israeli bombs from jets that we supplied to Israel. We don't care as much about them as about Israel's, quote, right to defend themselves. And I think the American church does tilt way too strongly in the Israel direction. And the American foreign policy clearly does, for whatever reason. So in general terms, your friend is right. I would also like to take your friend to some of the places where there are people who, risking their own lives sacrificially, do bring refugee supplies, clinics,
you mean Christian
teaching in schools,
missionaries?
Christian missionaries, and they are not there primarily to convert. They are there primarily to live out the values that they believe in following Jesus.
That would lead me to another question. From what I understood from your writings, Philip, there is many personalities. They have big impact on the way you think and the way you write. Who's your hero outside of the Bible?
You are asking this 1 week before I go to India to talk about my hero, who was born 100 years ago. He was born.
I thought he's one of those.
He is one of those. But I mentioned earlier that my father died when I was 1 year old, so I never really knew a father, had no father growing up. And years later, as an adult, as a young journalist, I was given a father, and I followed him around for 10 years. He's a doctor, a surgeon, British surgeon. My hair used to be really long or I would tell my mother, it's not long, it's wide. And he was a distinguished silverhead surgeon from Britain. And so we were kind of like a Mutt and Jeff couple. But for 10 years, I got to know this man who worked with leprosy patients in India. And I saw him live out the values of Jesus. I saw him caring for the least of the people, the least of the least, these leprosy patients who he would invest hours just remaking their hands and their feet. And we tend to think, oh, how sad he could be in a nice suburban home with 2 cars in a garage and live like a rich doctor, you know. I've never met anyone who was more joyful and more fulfilled. And frankly, all of my heroes have this in common. The one statement that Jesus made that's repeated in the Gospels more time than any other goes like this. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But 6 different times he says a version of this. He says, you don't find your life by acquiring more and more. You find your life by giving it away to others in service. And when you do that, you actually find your life. And all of the heroes, as I look back on them, they're people who, if you just step back, you think, they're crazy. They have all these opportunities just to indulge, and instead they're caring for these people. But as I got to know these people, they're the ones who benefit most. Jesus is right. That's how you find your life, not by just sitting by a swimming pool, drinking margaritas, you know, watching television, whatever. You find your life.
And getting big.
That's right. Yeah. You find your life by giving it away to others.
Are you promoting poverty? Are you saying poverty is a good thing? Some of my viewers, they would say, those guys, they have everything, and they're saying, yes, poverty is good for you.
I'm promoting service.
That's different.
Part of service is using wealth for
you have it
causes.
And you give it away.
Yeah, you have it in a. I mean,
do you met people they did what you're talking about?
Yes, I wrote a book. I think it's in Arabic. In English, the title is Soul Survivor. And
بالكاد نجوت in Arabic.
Thank you. And as you look at those people, they are people who could have gone one direction, and because of their faith, wanting to be like Jesus, went another direction, and actually ended up being better.
Some
off.
of those names.
Well, Paul Brand is one.
That's your hero.
My hero. Robert Coles was a professor at Harvard, a psychiatrist, and then
that's another Christian man. But you have some heroes, they don't belong to your faith.
Gandhi was one. Martin Luther King. For me, he's a Christian. Not all Americans see him that way, but to me, he's a man of deep, deep faith. Of course, he was a minister.
He had his mistake like anybody else.
That's right. And Mahatma Gandhi. And you know, this whole thing.
How about women? You don't have any. I'm sorry to interrupt.
There's one woman in there, Annie Dillard. I had a couple of other women, but they lived in other countries. And when I wrote the book, I didn't have enough information on them. I would have to go back. For instance, there was a British woman named Cicely Saunders. And she was concerned, she worked as a social worker in a hospital, and she was concerned that when people were almost dying, that the nursing staff treated them differently. They would just not even enter the room. They just open the door and say, "How are we today, Mrs. Smith?" because they knew they were dying. And she thought, this is not right. When you're dying, you should know, you should be able to prepare. So she went back and became a nurse, and then she went back and became a doctor just to come up with a new way to treat the dying, and she formed the modern hospice movement. I presume you have hospices in the Middle East as well, but there are thousands around the world, places to go where you spend your last days, where you are living until you die, not places to go to die, but places to go to live until you die. And
that's a good way to see it.
Yeah, and she's one of my heroes. But I didn't.
Did you get the chance to meet with Mother Teresa?
I never met Mother Teresa.
But you are with people around her, or people they know her?
Yes. In fact, Dr. Brand knew her quite well because she worked with leprosy patients, and she would call him on advice on how best to do that. He was actually the only Westerner on the board of Mahatma Gandhi. After he died, all this money came in, millions and millions of dollars. And all of them on the board were Indians except for Dr. Paul Brand, and they determined how that money would be used. So both Gandhi and Mother Teresa, I kind of got to know through Dr. Paul Brand.
As an evangelical, can you see other people saved outside of the evangelical faith? I'm talking about other Christians, at least.
Boy, I hope so, and yes, I can. Again, I go back to what I know about God. There's a song, a hymn that I love called "There is a Wideness in God's Mercy," and we humans keep trying to narrow God, put God in a little box. That box looks just like us. And as I read the Bible, the whole story is widening, widening. God wants his family back. The story of the Bible is, my family has strayed away from me. I want them back. And that's God's invitation to all of us. Not everyone is going to accept that invitation, but that is God's invitation.
Why do you believe in mission?
Because you use the word evangelical. What does that word mean? It means good news. And I believe in mission because I believe we have good news about this world, why this world came to exist. There is a God, that God loves us, even though we have no reason to be loved, and that God has shown us the most fulfilling way to live. It's the way in which we can thrive. And if that's good news, it's like if I had a cure for cancer, naturally I would want to immediately go and tell the world about it. Well, I have a cure for a lot of the problems in this world. I want to go and tell people about it.
You said one time, or you wrote this, if the good news is so good, why it's not attractive to people?
Yeah. And that's the church. That's because we're not Jesus. We're not perfect. We make all sorts of mistakes. And I know about this because I grew up in one of those churches. In the church I grew up in, it didn't sound like good news at all. It sounded like bad news. And I had to go away from that for a time to realize it really is good news. And now as a writer, one of my themes is to come back and again and remind us it's good news that we have to share. It's for our own benefit that God has revealed what he has.
Also, you learned through your hero in India that pain is a good thing. It's not always a bad thing.
That's right.
That's a really challenging concept. It's really, when I read it first time, it shaken me. Like, it was, wow.
Yes.
It was like an open eyes.
Yes.
Pain is a good thing? Pain it is.
Yeah, I got to unpack that a little bit. But especially in the West, where we have pills and anytime you have something wrong with you, you go to a doctor and they can at least make you stop hurting, you know. We think
Solution
of
for everything.
pain is the enemy. Well, actually, Dr. Brand, my hero, was the person who discovered that the terrible, dreaded disease, leprosy, the only thing leprosy does is destroy pain cells. So if you lose your fingers, if you go blind, that's all because you don't feel pain. It's not the disease doing that. The disease silences nerve cells. So if I have something in my eye and I don't feel pain, I may rub it like this, and gradually I'll go blind from the infection, from doing that. But it doesn't hurt. And so I've spent times in leprosariums, and you don't want that life. It's the life where they don't feel pain. He actually would do surgery on people with leprosy without anesthesia. They don't feel pain. So he said, pain is a gift. If I had one gift to give to my leprosy patients, it would be the gift of pain. And
it's the red light. Pay attention.
That's right.
You have something.
It's the warning light. And obviously, not all pain is good. Not all suffering.
You mean like
is
before
good.
him, nobody get to this conclusion? Pain, there is something good about pain.
Well, every doctor knows pain is a good warning signal, because why do we go to the doctor? Because it hurts.
Yeah.
But he was the one who discovered the connection between painlessness and leprosy, so that if you want to know what a pain-free life looks like, visit a leprosarium. It's not a beautiful thing. But I would go further, Ahmed, and say that no matter what happens to us, pain can be useful. It can be, Christians call it redemptive. I would say recycled. God can take it and use it for good. You know, when I throw away junk, recycler takes that and makes something good out of it. And in my own life, I was in a life-threatening auto accident. I think you were as well. And as we look back, we realize these are important moments, that maybe the most important moments of our lives, where we were forced to go up against what matters most in life, and it changes the way we live.
نخرج في هذا الفاصل مع هذا المفكر الذي يجرؤ دوما أن يضع السؤال كتحدي ولا يهرب منه. فابقوا معنا في ممنوع. يسوع الذي لم أكن أعرف. The Jesus I never knew. هذا الكتاب يتكلم عن يسوع المسيح بجرأة وصراحة، يتكلم عنه كإنسان وإله حاضر بقوة في الكتاب المقدس وفي حياتنا، يخترق الآراء المقلوبة والتافهة لكي يعطينا ترياقا قويا ليسوع المفترى عليه وللصور غير الملائمة عنه، لكي يكشف لنا عن الحقيقة المعقدة وتأثير يسوع الناصري في الحياة اليوم والأمس وغدا. مهما كان اعتقادك في يسوع، فإن ميلاده كان بالغ الأهمية لدرجة أنه قسم التاريخ إلى جزئين. إن كل شيء يحدث على الكوكب يمكن تقسيمه إلى قبل المسيح أو بعد المسيح. هل يسوع الذي يتكلمون عنه في الكنيسة هو يسوع الحقيقي؟ كيف استطاعت الكنيسة أن تلطف من حدة هذه الشخصية الثورية؟ وقلمت مخالب يهوذا بكفاءة، وشهدت عنه بأنه منزلي وأليف مع رجال الدين والسيدات العجائز التقيات. يسوع يدخل إلى العالم وسط جو مشحون بالكفاح والرعب. قضى فترة طفولته مختبئا في مصر. أدخل يسوع تغييرات عميقة في رؤيتنا لله وعن الله. يسوع الذي لم أكن أعرف، كتاب لفيليب يانسي. نعود إذن بعد هذا الفاصل. Philip, you said that lots of talk about common ground, Jews, Christian, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, and you travel a lot. I would love to ask you a question about your travels and another question about coexistence. Do you think Muslim, Christian, Jews can live together in peace?
I mentioned the weekend I spent with 10 Christians, 10 Jews, and 10 Muslims. And, you know, the Christians don't have a good history with the Jews. There have been many, many times in history when we've turned against the Jews. We call them Christ killers. There have been pogroms, and so the Christians were very apologetic about what we have done to the Jews over the years. And as we're together all weekend, we felt very comfortable being on the sidelines because the Muslims and the Jews were the ones fighting each other. And we thought, ooh, at least we're not the ones fighting.
The bad one.
I know. But that would be an example, wouldn't it? With this terribly poisoned history between Christians and Jews, the Jews would say, despite that history, now we coexist very happily in your country, the United States, and in parts of Europe. And the Muslims also were all from America, and some of them originated in other countries, Palestine, but some of them lived in Detroit, some of them lived in Washington, D.C., and there definitely was coexistence there. It gets complicated when you're carving up land. You know, this is my land, this is your land, and no one has found a solution to that in the last 20 years or so. But I was very encouraged as I went away from that weekend because we started with common ground and we left with common ground, a common humanity.
Some Christian, they will reject the idea of common ground. They will accept the common ground idea just to live together, but not when it comes to religious talk. How do you see that?
Well, I go back to the examples that we have in the New Testament. I look at how Jesus handled people who saw the world differently. For example, there's a story of Jesus, it's in Gospel of John chapter 4. Jesus meets this woman, a Samaritan woman. So she's kind of that not approved by either group. She's the outcast. And
You mean by the Jews, she's
by the
rejected as a
Jews,
Samaritan and a
correct.
prostitute. And by the Samaritan as prostitute.
That's right. That's right. And Jesus starts talking to her. The disciples are rather shocked that he would spend time with a woman like this. And she wants to deal with the differences. She immediately starts talking doctrine. What mountain should we worship at? You know, our father, your father, should it be this mountain or this mountain? And if you watch carefully, Jesus avoids those questions. He goes to the heart of her problem. He just says, I sense you're thirsty. Are you a thirsty woman? Yes, I am thirsty. The water that you've been drinking, does it satisfy? Well, no, it doesn't. Would you like to know about a water that does satisfy? And I think that's the key. Evangelism is really caring about the person. It's loving a person. And if a person has an acknowledged thirst, yes, we should point them to the living water that can solve that thirst. But why do we do that? We do that because we love them. I have a friend who says, don't think in terms of friendship evangelism, think in terms of friendship. Don't think of loving so that they'll become a Christian. Think of loving because that's what we're supposed to do. We love because God is love. God's essence is love. God cannot not love. He can't help loving. And Jesus said, in the same way that God cares about the wicked, it actually says that, the wicked, and the sun shines on the evil as well as the good, that's the attitude that we should have toward people who are different than we are.
Revenge or forgiveness?
Forgiveness.
If you lost your loved one in 9/11.
Well, the problem with not forgiving is that you carry that wound the rest of your life for your own sake. The only way you can stop that chain of revenge. I mean, look at history. Go to the Balkans, where I've been to Sarajevo, I've been to the former Yugoslavia, and they're telling me, well, this happened in 1914, yes, but this happened in 1600, yes, but this happened in 1300, and it just goes on and on and on, and not until someone stands up and says, okay, stop. It's like Nelson Mandela when he was elected president. Here he'd spent 27 years in prison. Now he's president, and at his inauguration he says, he quotes Mahatma Gandhi. He says, the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, pretty soon the whole world will be blind and toothless. Yeah. He said, we don't have time for revenge. We don't even have time for justice. We need to show the world.
That's a good statement. We don't even have time for what?
For justice.
Then what's the time for?
Reconciliation, he said. And that's when he announced, now these terrible crimes have been committed. How are we going to deal with them? Not by shooting the people who did them, not by locking them up in prison, but by a commission, the Truth and Reconciliation
And he wasn't Christian before he goes to prison. He said he finds Jesus in prison.
Well, I've read different accounts of that. He went to a Methodist mission school, so he certainly knew Christianity. And a lot of people feel that he on purpose did not talk much about his faith because he wanted to represent all of South Africa, and not everybody was Christian.
Politically correct.
Yes, that's right.
What do you say to those who will criticize you about your outside Bible, biblical figures as your heroes?
I would say, okay, let's talk about biblical figures as heroes. and there I go to the exact same principles. If you look at the Old Testament, who are the greatest characters in the Old Testament? You'd have to say King David would be one, Moses would be another. Okay, Moses murdered a guy, had an anger problem. King David murdered a person, committed adultery. If you go to the New Testament, who are the heroes? Well, Peter and Paul. Peter denied Jesus. They tried to pin him down. Didn't you know this guy? I never knew the blankety blank 3 times. Paul was Saul at the time, made his living by persecuting Christians. And how did these people become the heroes? I think God actually deliberately chose these people so that nobody would have an excuse to say, I'm beyond the reach of God's grace. I'm beyond the reach of being able to be transformed. You've got a murderer, you've got an adulterer, you've got a traitor, you've got a torturer, human rights abuser. These are the ones that our religion is founded on, because God can take that and transform it and turn it into something good. That's the hope that we all have, because we all screw up at times.
As a journalist who traveled a lot and met lots of VIPs, tell me a little bit about your travels. What did you learn as a bottom line after visiting 70 countries?
Right.
A little bit more.
Yeah, I learned that if I'm speaking to these audiences, people are very different. So for example, I go to Sweden or Scandinavian countries, and they just sit there like this. They don't smile, they don't laugh, they don't cry, they just sit there. And then they come up later and says, Mr. Yancey, that was the most moving sermon I've ever heard in my life. I didn't even know you were alive. But you go to South America or the Middle East, and people are much more expressive. I mean, you've been to these places, and they come up and hug you and maybe kiss you, and you feel,
we're gonna end this talk about with kissing, like the Middle East too.
Yeah. And what I've never learned hospitality such as in the Middle East. You're renowned for hospitality, so that you go to a tent in the desert and they'll take whatever they have, the one goat, and create a feast for you. And this is so true. It's embarrassing. People come to the United States and we say, okay, rent a car at the airport and we'll meet you at a restaurant. In the Middle East, they pick you up, they give you flowers, they take you to their own home. It's a beautiful thing.
And the other question is about when you met with VIPs. I would love if you can give me some names, and what do you have in your mind, like, last after all these interviews and experiences with people like Clinton?
Yeah. Well, when you talk to people at that level who are so used to dealing with the press, it's very hard to get past kind of the canned answers. You know, they have to be so careful about what they say because someone is recording it and it's going to come out in the New York Times tomorrow. So they have to be very guarded. As a journalist, I don't enjoy interviewing the super famous people because it's so hard to get to what's authentic. Yeah. I really do prefer going to the people who are out of the spotlight, who are doing remarkable things.
Heroes.
Like my heroes, yeah.
But also, you succeed to interview one of those famous VIPs and you get to the depth. Like, can you give me an example?
Henry Nouwen is one. He was a professor at Harvard. He was professor at Yale, very distinguished psychiatrist, doctor. And he got tired of that life. He got tired of the prestige and the pecking order and all that, and had kind of a breakdown, if not an emotional breakdown, a spiritual breakdown. And then he eventually went to a place where they cared for the severely mentally retarded, mentally handicapped people. And I got to know him, and I must say, after spending a day with him, I could see why he went there. Because, I mean, my day is full of phone calls and emails and writing bills and checking royalties and all this stuff, you know, and his day was very simple, just one room that he lived in, and his job was to care for this one person who wasn't able to care for himself. And he said, I have learned more about God from what I'm doing now than I ever did when I was in seminary, when I was a priest, when I was at Harvard. And that's why I like to go to people like that, because I'm tempted toward toward these false idols that the West keeps dangling in front of me, and I know they're not what they promise to be, and I need the models of people who show me a different way to live.
I'll open this window for you in 2 minutes. Maybe you can take 3 maximum to tell whatever you want to say to our audience in the Middle East and North Africa. The people who read Philip Yancey and the people maybe just they heard about your name but they never read your books, yet they like you, or those who never heard about you and your mission in life in general.
Well, I have a special feeling for the Middle East. It is where my faith came from. And when you look back, it was the center of our faith for several hundred years, and then it kind of jumped over to Europe, and then it jumped over to North America, and now it's spread around the world. And the sad thing to me is that so many Christians in the Middle East have left. A lot of them live in my country, a lot of them live in Europe. And I look at what happened? Why did the faith keep moving from place to place geographically? And the only thing I can come up with is this phrase, that God goes where he's wanted. God goes where he's wanted. And I hope and pray that the Middle East will be a place that returns to the faith that I love, to the faith where Jesus was birthed. I'm one of the few Americans who has been to most of the countries around Israel, but never to Israel. I've not been to Israel. I've been to Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt and the Emirates and many of those places, but not to Israel. And I hope that the few Christians who are left will be that pioneer settlement, to show a different way to live, to show them the merciful God. The Middle East is full of conflict. It needs some examples of peace and wholesomeness and grace and mercy. And I hope that the Christian community there can be like light in darkness for those who wonder, is there such a thing as peace? Is there such a thing as a solution for my life?
How about your Muslim readers?
For my Muslim readers, I would tell you, keep searching, keep looking. You already have a great respect for Jesus. He's a prophet. And I also urge you, don't judge Christians by what you see on MTV, by what you see on CNN. I urge you to find those who truly orient their lives around trying to be like Jesus. It's easy, I know, to judge by stereotypes. A lot of Americans, when you say Islam, they think of terrorists. And as I know, having been in the Middle East, there are so many wonderful, peace-loving, hospitable people who are trying to follow what you believe. Give Jesus a chance, get to know him. Even growing up in a Christian background, I had misconceptions about who Jesus is. You probably don't know the full picture of Jesus either, so I would encourage you to get to know that Jesus.
Thank you, Philip. في خاتمة هذا اللقاء لا يسعني إلا أن أشكر فيليب. شكرا. Thank you. ممنوع يودعكم على أمل اللقاء بكم في حوار آخر من بلد آخر. هذا عماد دبور يحدثكم من كولورادو في لقاء ممنوع بشكل متجدد. السلام على مشاهدينا في العالم العربي أينما كنتم.